The story of the Bosnian War is one of the most complex, tragic, and devastating conflicts in late 20th century Europe, a war that unfolded in the heart of the Balkans, reshaping lives, borders, and identities. To understand how Bosnia descended into chaos in the early 1990s, we have to step back decades, even centuries, into a region layered with history, ethnic diversity, and political tension. It wasn't a sudden eruption, but the result of years of accumulated divisions, mistrust, and political maneuvering that collided with the fall of communism and the disintegration of Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was born out of the ashes of World War I, stitched together as the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes in 1918. It became Yugoslavia in 1929, and after World War II, under the leadership of Josip Broz Tito, it transformed into a socialist federation made up of 6 republics: Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, and Macedonia. In addition to these republics, 2 autonomous provinces, Kosovo and Vojvodina, existed within Serbia. This federation was an experiment in holding together peoples who spoke similar languages but carried different religious, cultural, and historical traditions. Serbs were mostly Orthodox Christians, Croats largely Catholic, and Bosniaks, Bosnian Muslims, were predominantly Islamic, with centuries of Ottoman influence in their history. In Bosnia in particular, these groups lived side by side, often in the same towns and villages, making it one of the most diverse parts of the federation. Under Tito, Yugoslavia maintained a delicate balance. He suppressed nationalist movements with force when necessary, while promoting a Yugoslav identity that was meant to transcend ethnic lines. His charisma, authority, and the relative prosperity of Yugoslavia compared to its Eastern Bloc neighbours helped hold the federation together. But beneath the surface, old grievances and ambitions lingered. Each republic had its own historical memory of victimhood and domination. Serbs remembered centuries of Ottoman rule and the massacres they suffered during World War II under the fascist Ustaša regime in Croatia. Croats remembered their own struggles against Serbian dominance in the interwar kingdom and later repression under communism. Bosniaks, scattered and without their own republic until Bosnia itself was recognised, often felt caught between larger national projects of their neighbours. Tito's system worked, but it was built on his personal control, and when he died in 1980, the foundation began to crack. The 1980s were a difficult decade for Yugoslavia. Economic crisis gripped the country, with rising unemployment, debt and inflation making life harder for ordinary people. The federal government struggled to manage growing inequality between the wealthier republics like Slovenia and Croatia and poorer regions such as Kosovo and parts of Bosnia. Political decentralization, introduced by Tito to balance power between republics, meant the central government was weak and often paralyzed by competing interests. In this vacuum, nationalism began to resurface. Intellectuals, writers, and politicians increasingly emphasized the suffering and rights of their own ethnic groups, sowing division rather than unity. It was in Serbia that this nationalist revival found its most powerful voice in Slobodan Milošević. Rising to power in the late 1980s, Milošević embraced Serbian nationalism as his political tool. He tapped into Serbian fears that their people were being oppressed, particularly in Kosovo, where the Albanian majority demanded greater autonomy. Milošević skillfully manipulated these concerns, presenting himself as the defender of Serbs everywhere. He worked to centralize power, weakening the autonomy of provinces and asserting Serbia's dominance within Yugoslavia. His rhetoric spoke of protecting Serbs not only in Serbia proper, but also in Croatia and Bosnia, where significant Serbian populations lived. This idea that all Serbs should live in one state would become central to the coming wars. Meanwhile, in Croatia and Slovenia, leaders began to push for greater independence. Slovenia, the most economically developed republic, was particularly frustrated with the federal system that drained its wealth. Croatia, under the leadership of Franjo Tudman, embraced its own brand of nationalism, recalling Croatian suffering under Serbian dominance. By the end of the 1980s, Yugoslavia was increasingly polarized between those who wanted to maintain the federation, largely under Serbian dominance, and those who wanted independence. Bosnia and Herzegovina, with its mixed population, was caught in the middle of these competing visions. By 1990, communism was collapsing across Eastern Europe, and Yugoslavia was no exception. Multi-party elections were introduced in the republics. In Bosnia, 3 nationalist parties rose to prominence, each representing one of the main ethnic groups: the Party of Democratic Action led by Alija Izetbegović for the Bosniaks, the Croatian Democratic Union representing Bosnian Croats, and the Serbian Democratic Party under Radovan Karadzic for Bosnian Serbs. Rather than uniting the republic, these parties deepened divisions, as each group voted largely along ethnic lines. Bosnia's fragile unity was eroding quickly. The first major rupture came with Slovenia and Croatia declaring independence in June 1991. The Yugoslav People's Army, dominated by Serbs, attempted to stop Slovenia but quickly withdrew after a short conflict known as the 10-Day War. Croatia, however, descended into a brutal war as Serb militias, backed by the Yugoslav army, fought to carve out Serb-controlled areas. The violence in Croatia, with ethnic cleansing and massacres, foreshadowed what was to come in Bosnia. Serb leaders argued they were protecting their people from Croatian nationalism, while Croats insisted they were defending their independence. The international community watched with concern, but decisive action was lacking. For Bosnia, the crisis was now impossible to avoid. The republic was ethnically mixed in a way Slovenia and Croatia were not. According to the 1991 census, about 44% of Bosnia's population were Bosniaks, 31% were Serbs, and 17% were Croats, with the rest belonging to smaller groups. Unlike Croatia or Slovenia, there was no clear majority that could dominate. The Serb leadership, influenced by Milosevic, insisted that Bosnia must remain within a Yugoslavia increasingly dominated by Serbia. Bosniak and Croat leaders, however, feared that staying meant subjugation to Milosevic's vision of a greater Serbia. Bosnia was on the fault line and the tension was unbearable. In late 1991, as Croatia's war raged, the Bosnian parliament debated the republic's future. Alija Izetbegović argued that Bosnia should be independent, a sovereign state that belonged equally to all its citizens. Radovan Karadzic, the Bosnian Serb leader, warned darkly that such a path would lead to catastrophe, predicting rivers of blood if Bosnia tried to break away. His threats were not empty. Already, Bosnian Serbs, supported by Belgrade, were arming themselves and forming militias. Plans were drawn up for the creation of separate Serb territories within Bosnia. Croatian nationalists, meanwhile, had their own ambitions, seeking to link Bosnian Croat areas with Croatia itself. The stage was set for Bosnia to become the central battlefield of Yugoslavia's collapse. The crucial moment came in early 1992. On February 29th and March 1st, Bosnia held a referendum on independence. The majority of Bosniaks and Croats voted in favour, but most Serbs boycotted the vote, insisting it was illegitimate. When results showed overwhelming support for independence, Bosnia declared itself a sovereign state. Within weeks, the European community and the United States. This was confirmation of their worst fears, that they would be forced to live in an independent Bosnia dominated by Muslims and Croats. Under Karadzic's leadership, they proclaimed their own entity, the Republika Srpska, and declared that Bosnian Serbs would not accept rule from Sarajevo. Armed conflict broke out almost immediately. The war in Bosnia officially began in April 1992, when Bosnian Serb forces, backed by the Yugoslav army, laid siege to Sarajevo, the capital. The city, with its diverse population and symbolic importance, became the focal point of the conflict. Shells rained down on neighbourhoods, snipers terrorised civilians, and residents endured years of deprivation and fear. Elsewhere in Bosnia, Serb forces moved quickly to seize territory, targeting towns and villages with brutal campaigns of ethnic cleansing. Non-Serbs were expelled, imprisoned, or killed, as the aim was to create ethnically homogeneous areas under Serb control. Massacres, detention camps, and systematic violence shocked the world. The horrors of places like Prijedor and Foča would become infamous. Bosnian Croat forces, too, pursued their own agendas, at times allying with Bosniaks against Serbs, and at other times turning against the Bosniaks themselves. The war was not just Serb against Bosniak and Croat, but often shifting alliances, betrayals, and multiple fronts. By the summer of 1992, Bosnia was in flames, and the international community was struggling to comprehend the scale of the disaster. The war in Bosnia by 1992 had entered a new and horrifying phase. Sarajevo, once a symbol of Yugoslav multiculturalism and coexistence, became a city under siege. Its streets, once filled with the sounds of bustling markets, children playing, and the call of church bells alongside mosques, were now scarred by snipers, shellfire, and checkpoints. Civilians lived in constant fear, venturing outside only at great risk. Food, water, electricity, and medical supplies were scarce. Schools and hospitals were targets as well as refuges, and survival became a daily struggle. Despite this, the people of Sarajevo demonstrated remarkable resilience, maintaining cultural life as best they could. Concerts, theatre performances, and underground newspapers became acts of resistance, reminders that life could persist even under relentless bombardment. Outside Sarajevo, Bosnian Serb forces moved to secure areas across the republic. Their strategy was clear: create contiguous Serb-held territories and eliminate non-Serb populations through terror, intimidation, and forced displacement. Towns such as Prijedor, Visegrad, and Foča became the sites of systematic ethnic cleansing. Men were separated from women and children, imprisoned, tortured, and in many cases executed. Women were subjected to sexual violence, often in organised detention camps. These atrocities were not random, but part of a deliberate campaign orchestrated by Bosnian Serb leaders who believed that removing the Bosniak and Croat populations would strengthen their claim to land and solidify the republic as an ethnically homogeneous state. Reports of these atrocities eventually reached the outside world, but in real time, the scale of the violence was difficult to comprehend. The international community's response was fraught with hesitation, misjudgment, and bureaucracy. The United Nations Protection Force, UNPROFOR, was deployed initially to protect humanitarian aid routes and safe areas, but its mandate was weak and poorly enforced. UN safe zones, intended as havens, were sometimes surrounded by hostile forces, leaving civilians trapped. NATO began limited air operations against Bosnian Serb positions, but these were constrained politically and militarily. Peace talks were repeatedly attempted, yet the entrenched nationalist ambitions and shifting local alliances made success elusive. By 1995, Bosnia had endured 3 brutal years of war, yet the conflict showed little sign of ending. Cities lay in ruins, entire communities had been displaced, and the death toll had risen into the hundreds of thousands. That year would mark both some of the darkest moments of the conflict and the beginning of its resolution. One of the most infamous episodes occurred in July 1995 in the eastern enclave of Srebrenica. Designated a United Nations safe area, Srebrenica was supposed to provide protection for civilians, particularly Bosniak refugees who had fled surrounding regions under the threat of Serb attacks. Thousands sought refuge within the town, trusting the presence of UN peacekeepers to shield them from violence. However, the Bosnian Serb forces, led by General Ratko Mladic, laid siege to Srebrenica and swiftly overran it. In the days that followed, Bosniak men and boys were separated from women and children and systematically executed. Estimates suggest that more than 8,000 Bosniaks were killed in what has been widely recognized as the worst atrocity in Europe since World War II. Women were often subjected to sexual violence while families were torn apart, and survivors were left with the trauma of witnessing or enduring unimaginable horrors. The massacre of Srebrenica became a defining moment in the war, crystallizing the international community's failure to prevent genocide and highlighting the limitations of peacekeeping under constrained mandates. The international reaction was swift but largely reactive. News of the massacre shocked the world, generating outrage and prompting renewed calls for intervention. NATO airstrikes intensified in the summer of 1995, targeting Serb artillery positions around Sarajevo and key infrastructure used by the Serb military. These strikes, combined with diplomatic pressure and the possibility of an expanded military campaign, signaled that the international community was no longer content to simply observe the carnage. At the same time, the Bosnian government, backed by Croat forces in certain regions, launched a series of offensive operations to reclaim territory and break the stalemate. By late 1995, the stage was set for the final negotiations that would ultimately end the conflict. The diplomatic process toward peace intensified, facilitated by international mediators who had learned from previous failed negotiations. Richard Holbrooke, the American diplomat tasked with brokering a settlement, took a direct, hands-on approach. The negotiation process culminated in the Dayton Accords, officially known as the General Framework Agreement for Peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina, signed in December 1995 at the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. The Dayton Accords represented a complex and often uneasy compromise. Bosnia and Herzegovina was recognized as a sovereign state, but the agreement divided the country into two autonomous entities: the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, primarily Bosniak and Croat, and the Republika Srpska, predominantly Serb. Each entity had its own government, military and administrative structure, while a weak central government was responsible for overarching matters such as foreign policy and trade. The agreement also included provisions for refugee return, the establishment of democratic institutions, and the presence of an international peacekeeping force to enforce the terms. While the Dayton Accords effectively ended large-scale military operations, they also institutionalized ethnic divisions. Bosnia's post-war political structure was heavily fragmented, reflecting the reality on the ground after years of ethnic cleansing and territorial conquest. The Accords prevented further immediate bloodshed, but the underlying social and ethnic fractures remained deeply entrenched. The human cost of the war was staggering. Approximately 100,000 people were killed and over 2 million were displaced, creating a massive refugee crisis. Cities were left in ruins with infrastructure, homes, schools on survivors, particularly those who had endured sieges, massacres, or the loss of family members, was profound. Communities that had once been integrated along ethnic lines were fragmented and trust between groups was shattered. International efforts in the immediate post-war period focused on reconstruction, humanitarian assistance, and the pursuit of justice. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, ICTY, established in 1993 by the United Nations, played a central role in holding individuals accountable for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Prominent figures, including Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic, were eventually tried and convicted, though the process was long and fraught with challenges. Rebuilding Bosnia required massive international support. The European Union, the United States, and other international actors provided funding, technical assistance, and expertise to restore infrastructure, return refugees, and promote economic development. Cities like Sarajevo gradually began to recover, though the scars of war were visible for decades. Schools reopened, cultural life resumed, and civic institutions were rebuilt, but the process was slow and complicated by the deep social and political divisions left by the conflict. Despite the Dayton framework, post-war Bosnia faced ongoing political and social challenges. Ethnic nationalism continued to influence politics, with parties often prioritizing the interests of their ethnic constituencies over national unity. Governance was complex and inefficient, with overlapping authorities and frequent political gridlock. Corruption, unemployment, and economic stagnation posed additional obstacles to recovery. Nevertheless, the war's end marked a transition from armed conflict to a fragile peace, creating opportunities for reconciliation and reconstruction even amid persistent difficulties. Education and memory became key tools for post-war healing. Efforts to document the war, teach future generations about its causes and consequences, and commemorate victims helped communities process trauma and foster dialogue. Memorials, museums, and cultural projects served both to honor the dead and to educate about the dangers of unchecked nationalism and ethnic hatred. Yet these efforts were uneven, as differing narratives about the war continued to circulate, often reflecting the perspective of one ethnic group over another. Economically, the post-war period was marked by challenges, but also by gradual recovery. Infrastructure rebuilding, foreign investment, and international aid helped restore basic services and economic activity. Many young people sought opportunities abroad, contributing to a brain drain that further hampered economic recovery. Despite these obstacles, Bosnia gradually re-established itself as a functioning state, though the legacy of war continued to shape everyday life and governance. Culturally, Bosnia sought to reclaim its pre-war identity as a diverse and multi-ethnic society. Sarajevo, with its history of coexistence among Muslims, Serbs, Croats and Jews, became a focal point for efforts to rebuild civic life. Festivals, arts programs and international collaborations sought to revive the city's cultural vibrancy. At the same time, efforts to promote interethnic reconciliation faced significant obstacles as neighbourhoods remained segregated and social trust had been severely damaged. The war's impact extended beyond Bosnia's borders. The conflict exposed the challenges of international intervention, peacekeeping, and humanitarian response in the post-Cold War era. Lessons learned in Bosnia influenced subsequent interventions in Kosovo, Afghanistan, and other crises, shaping doctrines around peace enforcement, the responsibility to protect civilians, and the limitations of military and diplomatic tools. Bosnia became a case study in both the potential and the limitations of international engagement in complex internal conflicts. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Bosnian War is the reminder of the human capacity for both destruction and resilience. Communities were torn apart, lives were lost, and societies were deeply scarred. Yet survivors rebuilt homes, schools, and lives. International justice mechanisms, while imperfect, demonstrated a commitment to accountability. Cultural preservation, education, and civic initiatives highlighted the enduring human desire for normalcy, dignity, and connection, even in the aftermath of trauma. The Dayton Accords provided a framework for peace, but reconciliation remained and continues to remain a work in progress. Ethnic divisions are still present in politics, education, and daily life, reflecting the lasting impact of wartime experiences. However, Bosnia's story also includes examples of cooperation, integration, and resilience, showing that societies can rebuild even after extreme conflict. Reflecting on the Bosnian War offers lessons about nationalism, identity, and the fragility of multi-ethnic societies. It illustrates the dangers of political manipulation, the consequences of international inaction, and the profound human costs of conflict. Yet it also emphasizes the possibility of rebuilding, reconciliation, and the persistence of human dignity even after immense suffering. For those who lived through the war, the memories remain vivid, shaping their lives and communities. For the world, Bosnia stands as both a cautionary tale and a testament to resilience. The conflict in Bosnia and Herzegovina reshaped the Balkans and left an indelible mark on global consciousness. It exposed the horrors of ethnic cleansing and genocide in the post-World War II era, demonstrating that mass atrocities could erupt even in Europe decades after the Holocaust. The war's end, facilitated by diplomacy, military intervention, and local resistance, showed that resolution was possible, but often costly and complex. Bosnia's experience continues to inform discussions about conflict prevention, peacekeeping, and post-conflict reconstruction worldwide. In the end, Bosnia's story is one of both tragedy and endurance. The war destroyed lives, communities, and trust, but the post-war period revealed the determination of survivors to reclaim their country, honour victims, and build a future despite the scars of the past. The Dayton Accords, though imperfect, established the basis for peace, and international justice mechanisms provided a measure of accountability for perpetrators. Bosnia's path forward has been neither smooth nor straightforward, but it has been marked by persistent efforts to overcome the legacies of violence, rebuild communities, and preserve the memory of those who suffered. As Bosnia continues to navigate the challenges of post-war recovery, the echoes of the conflict are still felt in politics, society, and memory. Survivors carry the weight of their experiences, while new generations grow up in a society shaped by both the trauma of war and the hope of reconstruction. The international community continues to monitor developments, provide support, and learn from the lessons of the past. Bosnia's journey is far from over, but its history stands as a testament to both the dangers of division and the enduring strength of human resilience.